Before we do any turning, what we've got to do is we've got to prepare something called a blank that's going to fit in between the driving fork and the live centre. Okay, and what we need to do is we need to find exactly the centre of the blank. Okay, and also we're going to remove the corners of the material so that when we put it in the wood lathe and it begins to spin round, when we start using the chisels to do the turning, it's not going to chip off the corner and damage it. It turns it, makes it much nicer and smoother to turn, and a little bit safer too. What you're going to need to mark this out correctly and prepare the blank is you're going to need a steel rule, we're going to need a pair of compasses, we're going to need a marking gauge, we're going to need a centre punch, we're going to need a hammer. Don't use the mallet, you'll break it. We're going to need a smoothing plane, and we're going to need a tenon saw. And you'll also notice that all my tools are in this bit here, which is called the well of the bench, which keeps everything safe, and it means nothing can fall on the floor and get damaged. What we need to do is we're going to prepare this blank for turning using the tools. So the first thing I would do is, or a bit of advice, is that when I'm marking things out, it's a good idea to use the bench vise. It just means it frees up your hands to do other things, and it means you're going to be a bit more accurate. So the first thing I want to do is I want to find the centre on the end grain of that bit of wood. Instead of measuring, which is difficult, we're going to use a tried and tested method of drawing a diagonal line from corner to corner, which will allow us to find the centre. Once we've found the centre, I'm going to take a pair of compasses, and we'll use the pair of compasses to draw as big a circle as I can on the end. And that's going to be the biggest cylinder that when I'm turning that I can create. Once I've done that, I'm going to use the compass to create an octagon by drawing arcs from the corner and the centre. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark. I'm just using these marks to construct my octagon. So I've found the centre. By drawing diagonal lines. I've drawn as big a circle as I possibly can. And then I've used the compass to construct an octagon. Next thing I'm going to do is, for preparing my blank, once I've got my octagon, is I'm going to use my marking gauge, and I'm going to set it from the corner to the first point of the octagon there. So I'm going to loosen the thumb screw. I'm going to move the spur into the right place. I'm going to lock it in place. I'm going to recheck. I would like to adjust. I just want to move it in a little bit, so I'm going to hold the stock, tap the stem until I'm in the right place. I'm happy with that. Then I'm going to use the marking gauge to draw my long parallel lines along the edges. Now when you're doing this, it's quite much easier maybe to get it on the edge of the bench, so it allows you to hold it. And we're just going to move the line down. Okay, and it just makes it easier to hold on. And I'm going to do that to every single corner. So on the bench, pushing it down and marking the lines. Now when you're doing that, try not to press too hard, or what happens is the spur goes into the wood and it follows the grain. Keep the spur at a slight angle when you're moving it, and you get a much nicer line. Right, once you've marked all the corners with the marking gauge, they're quite difficult to see, so I'm just going to take my pencil and I'm going to just put it in the groove that I've created with the spur of the marking gauge, and I'm just going to darken in the lines so it makes it easier to see. Okay. And I'm going to do that to every one. And then once I've done all the corners, I'm then going to take the pencil and I'm going to hatch off the bit that I'm going to remove. And the reason I want to hatch them off is it actually makes, when you're beginning to plane, it's easier to see when you're down to the line or not. Okay, and I'll show you that in a little minute. Once you have marked all the corners and darkened in all the lines and hatched off all the corners, the last thing you do before you trim off the corners, we also need to mark the centre on the other end. So we need to mark one end and we need to mark the centre here. So again, I'll just pop it in the vise so it can be accurate. Diagonal lines. To find the centre. So just a wee quick recap. To mark the blank out, we have found the centre on both ends by drawing diagonal lines. We've used a pair of compasses to draw a large circle. We've used the compasses to construct an octagon. We used our marking gauge to mark off the corners. We darkened in the lines and we hatched off the waist. To remove the corners, right, we're going to pop it in the vise. However, if we pop it in the vise like this and we're trying to remove any corner, it means that we've got to take the smoothing plane or the jack plane and we pop it and we've got to hold the plane at an angle and plane, which makes it really, really difficult. It's hard to use a plane at the best of times. To make it easy for yourself, hold the blank on its corners, okay? Which means now when I start doing my planing, I just need to concentrate on keeping the plane flat and planing off the corner like that instead of having it at an angle, and I'm much more likely to be accurate. So it's now at an angle, I've got my smoothing plane, I've checked it's set up correctly, it's going to take off a bit of paper width and pop it on. Like I said, I'm going to keep it at a slight angle and then I'm just going to begin to plane off the corner and I'm trying to maintain the same pressure on the heel and the toe all the time as I'm planing off the corner. Okay. The other thing is when you're planing, if you can try and use your body to move the plane more than just your arms, you'll make a better job. Okay, so you're using your legs should be moving when we're doing the planing. And now if you see, the reason that I put all the hatch marks on is I can look at the little lines there, and as they're getting shorter, I'm getting closer to the line that I want to plane to. So it's just an extra little guide. It makes it easier to plane. Quite often as you're planing, you'll press a little bit harder on the toe than the heel, which means you plane off more at the front than the back. Stop, flip it round, and then plane it from the other side. And that just keeps all the corners the same. Okay. So I've now used my smoothing plane and I've trimmed it off, and if you're reasonably good at using a plane, you should be able to still keep the kind of the little groove that you marked with the marking gauge, but we've removed the corner. So taking off all the corners with the smoothing plane, and there's only two last things to do. Right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my centre punch, I take my hammer, and we're going to mark the centre. Now, to use a centre punch properly, if you just pop it on like that, it's very difficult to see whether you've lined up in the centre properly. To use a centre punch, take it on its side, rock it up until we're in the centre, so on its side, and then we rock it up, we know it's in the right place, and then it's just a small tap with the crossbeam hammer, either the crossbeam hammer or the claw hammer. And then we move it around to the other side, and again, keep it at an angle, get it in the right position, rock it up, give it a little tap. Okay, so we've marked the centres on both sides. On one of the ends, we're going to put it back in the vise, and we're going to take a tenon saw, and I'm going to cut a kerf, which is just a slot. And we want to create the slot so that the driving fork has something to grab in to start with when it spins it round. It's less likely to slip. So tenon saw on the line. Keep it at, like every time you use a saw, keep it at an angle to start with. Once you start the saw moving, you can bring it back down onto the material. And we're just going to give it a little slot there with the tenon saw. Okay, and that's the driving fork's going to bite into that and drive it round.